I was assaulted twice and raped once.
I have been raped.
So I've had 2 experiences of molestation.
I was molested as a child by my mother's boyfriend, and I was raped as an adult in my marriage.
I was digitally raped.
They put me in one room and they basically beat me up, tied me up, raped and tortured me for about 4 or 5 hours.
To me, rape culture is anything which doesn't actively discourage the objectification or the use of people. So that could be sexually, but that could be as any sort of physical object. And I think it's very apparent in things like film, TV, media, songs, and just everyday communication with people as well. The way that we communicate with each other can be really detrimental.
Glamorization of rape in music videos, perfume advertisements, Tom Ford advertisements, Tom Ford films, it's Nocturnal Animals. It's films that use storylines about rape only to show how much the male non-survivor of assault is suffering, how sad they are that their girlfriends got raped and we never hear about the girlfriend.
When people push myths about rape, or they deny that rape exists, or they pretend that people who report rapes are actually making things up when there's no evidence to back them up.
Rape culture is a huge term. I think it goes from the nitty-gritty of someone actually being raped to just the suggestion in everything.
Is everywhere. It's how society puts blame on the person that's been raped. It's how we tell women that, or men, it's what you were wearing, it's what you were doing, it's how you were behaving, it's all the unspoken messages that we're fed constantly. It's everywhere.
If I wore anything that made my parents' friends stare, I was told to cover up because it made me look older than I was, and they were men, of course they were going to look.
Rape culture starts from a young age. Boys will be boys, girls will be girls. A boy is okay to lift a girl's skirt up in infant school. A boy is okay to smack another girl because that's what boys do, they're boisterous.
It's the way that people in the media talk about victims and survivors of assault. It's the way that politicians talk about them. It's the way that people get patronised when they go and try and report an assault.
Victim blaming, it's the victim's fault, not the perpetrators, or the victim's fault as well as the perpetrators. That culture whereby they think that certain behaviours are okay. So you might equally say, as a rape culture, it's okay as long as she doesn't say no.
Particularly things like going out in clubs and the idea of pulling and getting drunk and like having your eye on the drunk people who may be a bit easier to get or pull.
It's celebrities being let off raping people. It's Ched Evans being endorsed to go around the country talking about the dangers of drinking rather than the dangers of raping. It's the judicial system not being able to support victims, but making it very, very hard for them indeed to report rape and assaults. It's seemingly limitless.
Nearly 500,000 people are sexually assaulted every year. More than 85,000 women and 12,000 men are raped every year in England and Wales. That's roughly 11 rapes of adults every hour.
A couple of years ago, I was digitally raped, which is a term that quite a lot of people are unfamiliar with anyway. But I had been in London for the day and had some panic attacks because I was having to deal with something as well. And a friend, or I thought was a friend, was looking after me and then walked me home, and I got dressed, got changed into my pyjamas and put my dressing gown on, and then I said to him that he could go. But he insisted on staying and making sure that I fell asleep, which at the time I was too tired to clock as something questionable. I was just exhausted, so I said to him, that's fine. And then he kissed me and I pulled away, and I tried to kind of, well, I didn't try to, I did. I verbally said to him that I didn't want anything to happen and that he should go, but he persisted and he carried on. And then he digitally raped me that night. I did physically and verbally and emotionally scream no. And then when he left the next day, I was living in accommodation with other people as well, so one of my friends thought that it was this consensual thing and congratulated me on having a guy around. And then that kind of spread a little bit, which for me was really difficult to deal with because people were congratulating me or making jokes about something, thinking that it was consensual and thinking that it was me finally getting some or whatever, but actually it was quite a traumatic experience for me.
So at 16, I was raped anally by my 25-year-old partner. At this point, I'd become very accustomed that these things just happen, although at this point I had considered committing suicide. But with this, I cried and I screamed and he didn't stop. He told me to just give him a minute. I cried and I screamed and I told him that it hurt, but he just wouldn't stop.
I was sexually assaulted 3 times. Once I was at a party, I'd stayed over with a friend who I trusted, and I woke up in the morning, he had his things inside me. I pushed him off and he did it again. I didn't recognise that as assault for many, many years. About 10 or 12 years, I didn't even recognise the fact that it had happened. And then when I did, it took me a long time to really come to terms with the fact that that was assault. And then once I had come to terms with that, I actually got in touch with him and I told him what I remembered happening, and I told him all about the impact that it had on me. And then he took responsibility for it, and he said that he was aware that what had happened was assault and he'd been carrying it around with him for many years as well. And we were able to have a conversation which made me feel like I was able to give the burden of that back to him, so I was no longer carrying that burden with me. The 2 other assaults I had, another was at a party that I'd stayed over on a sofa at a friend's house. I woke up in the morning with a stranger next to me on the sofa, and he, very similarly actually, he had his fingers inside me. I have no idea how long he was going on doing that for until I woke up, because obviously it takes a while for these things to actually wake you from sleep. And when I pushed him off, he got up and left. He was a stranger. I would never recognise him, I don't think, if I saw him again. So I have no way of finding him, even if I wanted to. And the 3rd occasion was someone that I'd been seeing on and off for some time. It wasn't really an official relationship. We'd just been hanging out together. I'd not had sex with him. But I did allow him one night to stay over at my house, and I was woken in the night with him having sex with me. At that point, I was shocked and I didn't know how to respond. I got up and I left the room, and I never said anything further.
Only 15% of people who are assaulted report it to the police, and less than 6% of reported cases result in a conviction.
I did not report my rape to the police because he was my partner and because my best friends didn't believe me. My employers didn't believe me. My parents didn't actually believe me at first. I was like, how am I going to get the police to believe me when I have 0 evidence?
I didn't report it. I pretended that it didn't happen because I felt this shame. I felt like people would think that it was just me regretting it the next day.
At the time, I believed all the unspoken messages that we are fed by society, and I thought, we would get into trouble because we were staying in a flat where we weren't meant to be. I had been drinking, I was underage, and I had so much shame as well, and I thought that I had brought it on myself because of how I had behaved. I know now that is not the case. It is never ever a woman's fault, but yeah, I believed even at 13 all the messages that we were fed.
He was arrested, charged. I count myself as very lucky because he admitted it. So I was very lucky. I didn't have to go to court. I didn't have to give evidence. He pleaded guilty and he was sentenced to a mere 18 months in jail. For what I went through, not just from what he did, but from how I was treated afterwards by the school, by the police, the medical exam, it wasn't enough. For what I went through, it was not enough.
What you will find, sadly, is a lot of cases fail to make it to a report to the Crown Prosecution Service. Quite a large percentage would not meet that criteria and threshold. Now, there may be many reasons for that. That may not be about the lack of credibility or the proof involved, or that the person is making it up. It's absolutely not necessarily anything to do with that. There may just be insufficient evidence to show who has committed this offence for them to be reported to the Crown Prosecution Service.
Incidences of falsely reported rapes and sexual assault are a tiny portion of those reported, and any that are falsely reported will get found out along the process. Every person who comes forward with an allegation of rape or assault must be treated as telling the truth.
I think there are very few cases where victims are lying. There are some cases where people are mistaken. There are some where they're not actually sure whether or not that any sexual activity has taken place, and that then may shock you. I think there are very rare cases where that occurs. So it's more often than not, nobody would approach the police to go through that really rigorous and trying process that it needs to be. They don't come forward lightly, and they don't come forward deliberately lying. And very often you'll find, as I say, there will be two people, one of whom clearly believes they did not consent, and the other where they did feel that they consented. So it's very difficult to tease those out. Very few have actually involved anybody that I would say was actually lying about being assaulted at all.
When I was telling people that it happened, people didn't believe me because they assumed that because I'd lost my virginity through that, they assumed that I had regrets and that I just thought it was a mistake, or that I'd got drunk. I hadn't got drunk, but they assumed I had, and therefore assumed that I was lying, just because I didn't want to admit that I had what are quite normal urges for a teenage girl to have, and that I acted upon them when that wasn't the case. I remember that employers didn't understand why I would get really quite freaked out if somebody did enter my personal space, particularly within a few months after it happening. I remember my friends not believing me and spreading rumours and lies around the school. And I still have people to this day not believe that it happened. I just experienced a lot of rape culture, I guess, online as well. Like, people just don't believe your stories. They tend to think that everyone's lying because they want to somehow punish a man who's done nothing wrong. And that's really not the case. It takes a lot to come out and share your story.
You never forget the first words after you tell someone, or after you tell an adult. I should put that correctly. Because the first words are always something along the lines of, "That's a very serious accusation. Are you sure you're telling the truth?" And it doesn't matter who you are, whether you're a good student, a bad student, a well-behaved child that has never done anything wrong, not even was late to school once. You're still questioned. You're still asked that question as if it would be something fun to make up. I have to say the worst thing around those experiences was the initial telling of the school, the telling of my parents, my mother. I do think that was an awful one, it must have been an awful experience for her to go through, full stop, anyway. But I think it was made worse. I don't know how it works now, but at that time period, basically, we were all put in a room in a circle of chairs. Myself, my form tutor, the year tutor, the school nurse, a police officer that dealt with the school, my mum, and I think the head teacher as well was there. And that was how they told my mum. I was lucky I didn't have to go to court, but to have to stand there and face this person that has done these awful things to you against your will, and to have them call you a liar to your face, and then to have the thought that, well, what if everybody else believes them? What if they won't believe you? That's why people won't go forward. I understand there are people out there that lie or get confused or don't understand what happened to them. I understand that. But you can't dismiss people when they come forward with something so harrowing and so, if they're willing to go through the torture of explaining in detail exactly what they've been through, and then go through a medical procedure allowing people to photograph and measure and touch them, you have to give them the benefit of the doubt, because for people to put themselves through that again, they're not lying.
I, as a police officer, really want people to report matters if they possibly can, so that we can at least then know the identity of individuals who might be committing these sorts of crimes, because the misery that they cause is profound.
If we don't report it, then how are we ever going to make change? I don't have that much faith in the justice system, because I know where I live in Scotland, of all cases that make court, they only end up in prosecution in conviction of something like 4.5% of all cases that end in conviction. So I don't have much faith, but we need to challenge the justice system as well. There needs to be changes, because it is a serious crime. It needs to be taken seriously.
I think we just need to not question victims. So, like, when I first said about what had happened to me, one of my friends at the time did ask me whether or not it was something that I just regretted in the morning, and whether I wanted to go through with reporting it because I would be ruining his life and things like that. And I believed that friend at the time. So to just remove all questioning and to be that friend that just goes, that's awful, what can I do?
If I had ever read then that he'd gone on to do something to someone else and I could have put a stop to it, I would never have forgiven myself. So despite the way, well, despite what you're going to go through, despite what people will think and say, if it stops him doing it to just one person, if it stops him getting access to just one child or one other adult, it's worth every single tear and every single bit of anguish.
I think there are many really amazing people supporting victims of rape and serious sexual violence. So I would encourage in any way it is possible to go and see organisations such as Rape Crisis, even to the point of having forensic samples taken that are then just stored, so that subsequently, perhaps in a few weeks or months even, where you may want to take a case forward, having had time to recover to a degree, to think things through, to talk to people, those samples can then, because they've been properly stored and kept, can actually then be used to support your case.
If there weren't charitable agencies out there to help people like me, half the population wouldn't exist because we wouldn't survive it. We would walk off a bridge because we would think that not only are we better off for it, but those around us that go through it with us are better off without us.
Just to start by telling your own story, find a friend, find anyone, a therapist, a hairdresser, your neighbour, anyone that will really allow you to tell your story in its entirety as much as you can, because I think by keeping it trapped inside, I know that it's not healthy. It leaks out of us, and by giving it oxygen, we start to move it and it starts to, change shape. It occupies so much space in our body when we keep it trapped in, and when we release it, there's more space for more of us to come in. It's more of our aliveness can come back into us.